This is your fix.
I'm your host, Stassi Schroeder. Welcome to Tell Me Lies, the official podcast. What's the most unhinged thing of season 3?
Steven, because he's so evil.
I do think he is misunderstood.
You see everyone face consequences.
It's intoxicating. The writers just know how to trick you. There's always a twist in this show. Tell Me Lies, the official podcast, January 6th, and stream the new season of Tell Me Lies January 13th on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
Adobe Acrobat Studio, your team's home base. Collaborate within a shared PDF space. You've got your docs, your plans, your specs, and then invite the crew to build what's next. They talk up the teamwork. Here's an updated render. They think that this design could be a contender. But when somebody wonders what's the next step, AI helps you finish the rest. Bolts are tight, now your plan's refined. Run a smoother business when you're all aligned. Do that with Acrobat. Learn more at adobe.com/do-that-with-Acrobat.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of True Crime with Caitlyn. Today I'm going to tell you all the case of a serial killer. A case about a man who was responsible for murdering one of the world's most infamous serial killers. Jeffrey Dahmer is without a doubt one of the most prolific serial killers in not just America's history, but the entire world's. Over the span of 13 years, Jeffrey murdered 17 young men and teen boys. He would attempt to turn the victims into zombies. He assaulted them, he murdered them, he dismembered them, and so much more. Just 3 years into his over 900-year sentence, Jeffrey Dahmer would go from murderer to victim when he was brutally killed by one of his fellow inmates. This is the case of serial killer Christopher Scarver. Christopher J. Scarver was born on the 6th of July 1969 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the second of 5 children. Not much is really known about Christopher's really early life. What we do know is that he dropped out of James Madison High School in his senior year when he was in year 11. He was one of these people where school just wasn't for him. He really struggled academically and he didn't like having to answer or obey or submit to someone else. He didn't like anyone else telling him what to do. Christopher could be described as rebellious, but not violent at all. He had never gotten into a physical altercation. Following him dropping out from high school, he managed to get a place as a trainee carpenter within the Wisconsin Conservation Corps. This would give Christopher the opportunity to do something, to learn a trade, which would see him being able to go out into the big wide world and make something of himself, to find a job, to make his own money and to live his own life. Christopher was really excited to complete this course of training because his boss, a man named Edward Patz, had promised him a full-time job once he qualified. Edward saw the great work that Christopher was doing and he saw something promising in him. This would end up falling through, however. Edward actually lost his job, and so because he wasn't employed at the company anymore, he couldn't then hire Christopher, which was very disappointing for him. Christopher would end up dropping out of the course and started drinking. He would drink cans upon cans of beer every single night while smoking like 7 joints. He had started abusing cannabis alongside alcohol. He was still living with his family at this moment in time, but his mum, seeing his downward spiral, wasn't going to put up with it. She thought that Christopher was a bad influence on his younger siblings. He wasn't going to school, he wasn't working, he was getting drunk and high every day, he had no prospects, and it just wasn't the example that she wanted setting for her other children. So she made the decision to kick Christopher out. It was around this time that he learned that his girlfriend was pregnant. So Christopher is now 22 years old. He has no stable home. He doesn't have a job. He is dependent on drugs and alcohol. And he is about to become a father. That is a lot of incredibly stressful situations all happening at once to someone who is so young. Unsurprisingly, Christopher's mental health began declining, and this is when the family came. Not his physical, biological family, but the many voices inside of Christopher's head who he nicknamed the family. There were 4 voices that started coming to Christopher, telling him that he was the chosen one, he was sent by God or Jesus, and they would encourage him, motivate him even, to do the horrific. On the 1st of June 1990, Christopher arrived to the Wisconsin Conservation Corps to settle a debt, to get what he believed that he was owed. After not getting the job that Edward promised him, he felt like he was given false promises and that he was sold a dream. The job was something that Christopher not only desperately wanted, but needed, and in not getting it, he felt robbed by the company. Having not a single penny to his name, Christopher decided that he was going to rob the corpse. He was going to get his own back and take what he believed was rightly his. He arrived armed with a pistol and would hold 2 members of staff at gunpoint. John Fearn was a relatively new employee who had basically took over Edward Patz's job, and Steve Loam was an ex-manager of Christopher's. Christopher demanded Steve to get on the ground and ordered John to hand over some money. John rummaged through his pockets and pulled out all that he had on him and passed over $15. Christopher looked at the notes for a moment and then became consumed with rage. Throughout his life, he, as a black man, was subjected to disgusting racism, and Christopher internalized this and developed a resentment, a hatred directed towards white people. I can only imagine how much of an impact constant racism and being judged, mistreated, looked down upon, all because of the colour of your skin can have upon a person. And I appreciate that that would be horrible to go through, that would have a massive effect on someone. But Christopher himself, he would never take accountability for his own actions and the consequences that came with them. He would project his problems onto other people around him, predominantly the white people that surrounded him. Here, for example, he feels like he's been robbed of an opportunity by the corpse, and he genuinely believes that what he is doing in this moment is getting even. When John, a white man, tries to give him $15 when he is literally being held at gunpoint, this was like a slap in the face for Christopher, who once again felt like the white man wasn't taking him seriously. He felt disrespected and insulted, and of course, this infuriated him. In response to the $15, Christopher would shoot 27-year-old Steve Loam in the head, execution style, killing him instantly. He then turns to John and says, quote, "Now you think I'm kidding? I need more money." In a state of sheer panic, John whips out his checkbook and quickly scribbled out a check for $3,000, hoping that this would save his life. He is just saying what Christopher is capable of and has no problem in doing. He has murdered another man right in front of him, and John now believes that he could be next. Meanwhile, while John is writing that out, Christopher is ranting and raving all about his hatred of white people. He would continue to shoot Steve again and again post-mortem, shooting him in the head a total of 4 times. After retrieving the check, John's credit cards, and the $15, because he wasn't going to leave that behind, Christopher took off running out of the building while trying to shoot John. He didn't want to leave a witness behind, but thankfully each of the shots missed and John survived. He contacted the police, who found Christopher relatively quickly. He was sat outside of his girlfriend's house, almost like he was waiting for them to arrive, like he had anticipated and accepted what was about to happen. He made no attempt to flee. He didn't try to get rid of any evidence. He was still clutching the gun. He had the money, the check, and the cards all still on his person. At the scene, he told an officer, quote, "I don't know what came over me. I was never in any trouble with the law, never had a fight with anyone." He acknowledged that he knew what he had done, and he knew that what he did was wrong, and that he didn't know why he did it. He just snapped. He allowed the voices in his head to tell him to do it, and he followed their orders blindly. Apparently the voices were very reassuring to Christopher, telling him that all of this was going to go smoothly, that he would get away with it, and that everything was going to be fine. But of course, that isn't how it went. Christopher had murdered an innocent man in cold blood, and now he was going to get the consequences of that. The trial for the murder of Steve Loam took place in 1992, where Christopher Scarver tried to put forward a plea of insanity, citing the voices in his head. Being told by voices that you're a chosen one or that you're sent by Jesus can be a sign of mental illness. This wasn't accepted, however. Christopher was deemed fit to stand trial and would go on to be convicted of Steve's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Due to the violent nature of the crime, he was incarcerated within a maximum security prison in Portage, Wisconsin, that being Columbia Correctional Institution. Christopher's time here wasn't an easy one. I don't think anyone expects to go to prison and live an easy life. His mental health deteriorated quickly. He self-harmed, he made attempts to take his own life. On one occasion, he actually tried to set himself on fire during one of his attempts. Christopher was placed onto a mental health wing or facility within the prison, and this is where he would receive his diagnosis of schizophrenia, which makes the claims of hearing voices so much more believable. Having hallucinations, including auditory ones, hearing voices, experiencing delusions, are all symptoms of schizophrenia. Following the diagnosis, he was prescribed and would take medication to help stabilize his mental health. At around the same time that Christopher Scarver is incarcerated at Columbia Correctional, another man would be making his way there. But this wasn't just any man. This was a man that had a name that everyone in the country knew. Everyone knew the horrifying details of this man's heinous acts, and that was Jeffrey Dahmer. I'm sure that everyone listening to this episode is well aware of who Jeffrey is, either from watching a documentary, doing your own research, or even the recent Ryan Murphy Netflix series. But for those of you who might not know him, I'm going to give a very condensed overview of him and his crimes. Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer who was active for 13 years between 1978 and 1991. He murdered 17 young men and teen boys, his youngest victim being just 14 years old. He would target minorities such as Black and Latino boys and men. Jeffrey would lure them into his apartment in Wisconsin, where he'd drug them. He tried turning them into zombies. He assaulted them. He murdered them, dismembered their bodies, and actually stored some of the remains in his flat. At one point, he worked in a chocolate factory, and I'm pretty certain that he stored some remains in his work locker there too. He would also cannibalize some of the remains of the victims, eating them. Jeffrey Dahmer was finally arrested in 1991 and was transferred to Columbia Correctional in 92 with many life sentences and over 900 years to serve. Because he was so well known and his crimes were so horrific, Jeffrey immediately had a target put on his back. So for his own safety, he was placed into solitary confinement, where none of the other prisoners would be able to get at him, not necessarily that he was a danger to the other prisoners. During his time in solitary, Jeffrey found God and he was baptized a born-again Christian. He would spend around about a year here in in solitary before he started to really struggle. He had minimal time outside of his small cell, he had minimal human contact, and the lights were always on. After some to-ing and fro-ing, he was finally allowed to leave solitary, but because he was still very much a high-profile prisoner, he was always escorted by a prison officer wherever he went. Despite the risk to his life being exceptionally high, probably higher than anyone else in the building, this didn't stop Jeffrey from rage baiting, for lack of a better phrase. He would do things to purposefully provoke other inmates and even the officers as well. So it was said that one time he went up to one of the prison officers and told them, quote, "I bite." He would mold his food into what looked like limbs and squirt red sauce on them to make them appear bloody and then leave that for someone else to find. He once put up a poster where he was advertising a Cannibals Anonymous meeting, and in all, he allegedly walked around like he thought he was it. He was the biggest, he was the baddest, he was better than everyone else. He displayed no sorry or no remorse for anything that he had done, and it was just like he was rubbing it into everyone. The "I bite" comment, the moulding his food into dismembered limbs, and the Cannibals Anonymous meeting. These are not the actions of someone who is ashamed or sorry for what they have done. In all, Jeffrey Dahmer was a very disliked, hated inmate by both staff and prisoners alike. Christopher Scarver was well aware of Jeffrey. It would have been impossible for him not to have been, and he just tried to steer clear of him. Like everyone else around him, he hated the serial killer, who was everything that he despised personified. Christopher had heard of what he had done and just tried not to interact with him. He didn't want to cross paths with him. He didn't even want to see him out the corner of his eye. Why would he? Why would he want to be anywhere near a white man who horrifically murdered predominantly black men and didn't even seem sorry? In 1994, a very determined prisoner named Osvaldo Dorothy, who was a Cuban immigrant, had heard about Jeffrey all the way from another prison that he was being held in for drug charges, I believe. After hearing about Dahmer, Osvaldo was furious. The case engulfed him and he could think of nothing else than that, and he felt like he needed to act. Osvaldo managed to not only get himself transferred to Columbia Correctional from wherever he was being held, but he just so happened to be put in the cell next door to Jeffrey. Osvaldo would make his own weapon, melting a razor blade onto a toothbrush, creating a makeshift shank. One day in 1994, Osvaldo entered into the prison chapel, armed with the shank, and there was only one person he was aiming to use it on. Osvaldo attempted to slash Jeffrey Dahmer's throat, however the shank snapped, preventing him from inflicting any harm. The prison guards were quickly on top of him, separating the two, and Jeffrey left this interaction pretty unscathed. However, the next attempt on his life, he wouldn't be so lucky. On the morning of Monday the 28th of November 1994, 3 inmates at Columbia Correctional Facility were assigned a cleaning duty to clean the prison's gym. These inmates were 25-year-old Christopher Scarver, 37-year-old Jesse Anderson, a convicted killer incarcerated for the murder of his wife after he tried to pin the blame on 2 black men. I'm actually going to cover this case on my next episode, so make sure that you're following the podcast wherever you're listening so that you don't miss it. And the final and 3rd inmate on this cleaning duty was 34-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer. The men were collected from their cells, ready to start work at around about 8 a.m. They were escorted to the gym, which is obviously full to the brim with very heavy, dangerous equipment, which could double as weapons. And then they were left. I don't think there's ever been a clear answer as to why 3 very dangerous men, all of whom are murderers, were left alone, unsupervised. Some reports state that they were left for up to 20 minutes, however others said that they weren't left alone at all. Knowing what happens next, I'm not sure which one of those is worse. The men were unshackled and left to do their cleaning work. Christopher grabs a bucket, making his way to the toilet stalls where he's going to crack on with his cleaning, mopping up the floor. As he leans over to refill the bucket with some fresh water after doing some mopping up, he feels something prodding, poking in his back. He snaps his head around, turning to see Jeffrey and Jesse, and they appear to be laughing at him. Knowing Christopher's experiences and resentment towards white men, I can imagine that this just made him furious. Here he is, doing as he's told, cleaning the toilets, and then there are two white men laughing at him at his expense. Christopher stared out Jeffrey and Jesse, looking each of the men in the eye, trying to suss out who it was that had done it, who had poked him in the back, provoking him, but he couldn't tell. The men would all eventually go off in their own directions, cleaning different areas of the gym. And this is when Christopher decided he was going to confront Jeffrey Dahmer. With a 20-inch long, 5-pound heavy metal bar hidden in his clothes, Christopher creeped into a locker room where Dahmer was working. He cornered the serial killer, clutching a newspaper article all about Jeffrey's crime in his hands. Christopher is ordering Jeffrey to admit what he had done. Had he really inflicted all of that abhorrent, disgusting, unthinkable horror on innocent black men, some of whom were literally children? Christopher, like everyone else, was repulsed by what he had learned. In this moment, Christopher described Jeffrey as appearing really shocked at the confrontation, and his eyes are darting about, scanning the door. They're looking for an exit, a way out of this situation, a means of escape. And that was answer enough for Christopher Scarver, who lifted the metal bar into the air and slammed it down on Jeffrey Dahmer's head. Christopher would bludgeon Jeffrey with 2 blows which literally smashed his head in. He whacked the serial killer head against the wall repeatedly and then let him drop to the floor, where he was left, quote, gurgling in a pool of his own blood. Jeffrey never tried to defend himself or stop what was about to happen. He never called out for help, either from Jesse or one of the prison guards, and he didn't make a sound as he was literally being beaten to death. Did he even have time to consider what was about to happen to him and react? Or had he accepted that he was the most hated man in the entire world and was bound to get what was coming to him? Christopher didn't stop there. He would find Jesse Anderson in the toilet area of the gym, and in his own words, quote, he ended up dead. I put his head down. After committing a brutally violent double murder, Christopher took himself back to his cell. A prison officer who noticed him and knew that he should have been on cleaning duty asked Christopher what he was doing, and he responded, quote, God told me to do it. You will hear about it on the 6 o'clock news. Jesse Anderson and Jeffrey Dahmer are dead. Jeffrey Dahmer would be found at 8:12 a.m. in the locker room, so that entire ordeal happened in less than 15 minutes. He was lay in the same position that Christopher had left him in, and he was unresponsive. He was so badly beaten, having literally had his head caved in, that he was unrecognisable, and what remained of his face was severely swollen. Somehow, however, he was still alive, as was Jesse Anderson. Jeffrey, I do know, was actually reshackled before being rushed to the hospital. His injuries were so catastrophic that they were unsurvivable, and he died around an hour later. When his post-mortem was later conducted, however, the pathologist believed that he actually died shortly after the attack. Jeffrey's body would remain shackled the entire time, all the way up until his autopsy was conducted, even after he was well past pronounced dead. Something that I didn't know about Dahmer, which I don't know if this is common knowledge or not and I just missed it, was that his brain was removed by the request of his mother because she wanted it to be studied for science. She wanted to see if Jeffrey's acts, all the horrific things that he had done because it was something in his brain. It was something biological. Granting her request, his brain was removed and Dahmer was cremated without it. However, by December of 1995, a judge ruled that his brain must be cremated after Jeffrey's father fought against his mother's decision, saying that it was Jeffrey's wish. Jesse Anderson was placed onto life support upon his arrival at the hospital. However, 2 days later, it was switched off when it was determined that he would not survive his injuries. With the two men now dead, Christopher Scarver would once again find himself in the courtroom, accused of cold-blooded murder. Initially, he tried to plead insanity again. Maybe he thought that his request would be strengthened this time with him having his schizophrenia diagnosis, but it didn't. So instead, he pled no contest. After being convicted of the double murders, Christopher was handed an additional 2 life sentences, which was devastating for his son, who was born shortly after his incarceration. He hoped that one day his father might come home, but with these additional 2 life sentences, he had to accept that that was never going to happen. Christopher was transferred to several different prisons, where one of them actually kept him in solitary confinement for 20 years. 20 years living day in and day out in a tiny cell with no window, constant noise, constant lights on, and sometimes he had to endure sitting in over 100-degree heat. His mental health once again plummeted and he attempted to take his own life once more. Christopher would actually try to sue the prison for his time spent in solitary confinement on the grounds of cruel and unusual punishment. That would be thrown out, however, as the courts believed that his placement there was justified because he was such a dangerous man. Recent reporting states that Christopher Scarver is incarcerated within a prison in Cannon City, Colorado, where he fills his days by expressing himself creatively. He paints, he writes poems and short stories and songs. He has a good relationship with his son, who was also named Christopher, who is thriving in life. He credits that to guidance that he was given from his father. In 2015, Christopher Scarver stated in an interview that he did believe he was set up by the prison to murder Jeffrey Dahmer, but he wouldn't elaborate on this further as he feared retaliation. I think that says a lot. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. Don't forget to follow the podcast so that you never miss a new upload. You can find photos and updates over on the Instagram at TrueCrimeCaitlyn. I appreciate you for being here and I'll catch you all on the next one.